Snow sat on the eaves like a held breath. It gathered along the black tiles in soft, improbable cornices, and drifted from the trees beyond the garden to scatter over the stone path in a thin silver lace. Lantern light pooled in warm bowls along the walkway, making small islands of amber where the snow refused to take hold. From the bathhouse came the constant, familiar plume of steam, white, slow, conversational, thinning against the cold and leaning toward the windows as if to hear what the house might say in reply. Inside, the innkeeper knew every corner of her house by the way it answered. Sound was her map, the low, hollow thrum of the joists under heavy feet, the small, flat note the door made when it remembered to close the right way, the sigh the kettle gave when the flame grew patient enough. She went about the evening's choreography as if attending a ritual older than her own hands. With both palms, she coaxed the Noren aside and smoothed the paper lantern's skin until the seam lay flat. She tested the futons by the light of the brazier, where the cat, small as a thimble and twice as determined, had already claimed the warmed edge. She had lived long enough in the traveler's rest to have the house's breathing under her skin. Tonight, the listening felt particularly acute. The onsen's steam flowed like a shared secret into the corridor, carrying with it the faint mineral tang of hot water over stone. Outside, the snow answered with its muffled patience. The innkeeper, Hannah, moved between steam and snow in her wool socks, and an apron that had known more stitches than she could count. Her fingers were calloused at the tips, and the calluses remembered how to measure without looking. When a shadow was wrong in the lantern's light, she would kneel, as if to align the house's pulse with her own. Her hands stopped at the Noren. A small mouth torn in the heavy linen, no larger than a traveler's thumbprint, showed itself when she took the curtain in hand. It was the sort of damage that might have been ignored in warmer months, a private bruise, but in winter thresholds mattered. A tear in an entrance was a vocabulary for drafts and disrespect, and the house took both personally. Hannah brought the Noren closer to the lantern and traced the frayed threads where the fabric had given. The fibers were still lively, willing to be coaxed back into use. She ran a thumb over the edge and felt the slackness of a seam that had been used by too many hands. Small things, she said to herself, a habit more than a pronouncement. She set the Noren down and moved on, but the house had already given its summons. In the thin light on the shoji that stood by the bath, she noticed the paper's stubborn droop in a lower pane, sagging where somebody, perhaps impatiently, had pushed through too quickly. The shoji held the smell of steam and soap. The paper, once pasted, was meant to be a breath, a precise tension between inside and out. This was not catastrophe by any measure, but the inn regarded such imbalances like a temperamental neighbor. They required attention. A repair, even a modest one, is an invitation. Tea had not yet been poured when Hannah moved to the shelf and took down the narrow cedar box that held the mending tools. Beeswax in a small puck, a tin of crab hair needles sharpened to stings, a length of waxed thread amber as honey, a folded piece of indigo cloth for patches, and a strip of washi paper for the shoji found their places on the low table. She wore the tools like old gloves. Each belonged to a story of its own. The cat blinked in the lamplight and wound itself among the boxes as if auditing the inventory. Before she could begin, the courtyard lantern clicked, an old mechanism that the cold sometimes made stubborn, and the sound summoned the members of the neighborhood who kept a gentle orbit around the traveler's rest. They arrived without haste, one by one, stepping from the snow as a caravan of acquaintances rather than a procession of strangers. There was Kaito, the carpenter, whose palms were lined with the memory of planned wood. He smelled of shavings and oil. Mr. Arai, the elder and storykeeper, came with a slow, careful gait. His hat had a rim of frost, and his laugh was the sort that could loosen any stiffness. Sora, the gardener, arrived with a bundle of boughs at her back and the dry resin smell of sap on her cuffs. She moved as if she still had soil under her nails. The apprentices, Emmy, who had come to learn the ways of the house and the craft of stitches, and Finn, who could hold a plane with steady curiosity, followed, cheeks bright from the cold. Mr. Mori, the neighbor and odd job man, arrived last with a satchel of brass hoop and small metal scrap that had the twinkle of possibility. They were a circle made of necessity and custom. No announcement was needed. Hana let the Norin hang from the posts so the tier tilted toward the light like an invitation. Kaito's eyes found the shoji without a word. The cat, after inspecting each newcomer with the gravity of a small judge, settled finally on Hana's lap and made a sound like contentment given a human shape. Someone produced a kettle. The ritual of warming hands with tea is an old and efficient diplomacy. Tea steamed in thin, white bowls. The hourglass on the side table, the one kept for timing steeping and for remembering that laboring hands need measured pauses, was turned. A thin bead of sand began its fall. Conversation was soft. Directions for where to place the patchcloth. Memories of past winters and the curious accidents they brought. Small laughter about a time when Emmy had sewed 2 sleeves together and only noticed because her arms felt oddly brief. The elder spoke, as he often did, not to instruct but to set the air right. Once, Mr. Arai said, leaning back so his voice warmed like the tea. There was a storm that lasted 3 nights. The river rose like it did not intend to stop. We repaired then with as much humor as we had left. The stitches were visible on every coat and curtain after. We wore them like medals, and we kept each other warm with that certainty, that someone had mended what could be mended. It taught us to treat repair like an offering, not a cover-up. His anecdote landed neat as a coin. It gave the act a moral weight, but not the heavy kind. The villagers at the table nodded because they had their own medals of visible mending. Hana felt the story settle into the fibers of the Norin, as if it had always been there. Hana set about the first stage of the Norin's repair with a calmness that served both as instruction and as ceremony. She chose the patchcloth carefully. Indigo linen, the color of a deep winter sky, heavier than the Norin's worn linen, but flexible enough to fold and hold. She showed Emmy how to center the patch over the tear so that the weight would distribute, not pull. Emmy's fingers trembled, as they always did when the needle first came near her skin. She had the look of someone who wanted nothing more than to be useful, and was afraid of ruining the usefulness she had been given. Hana guided the youth's hands with a quiet steadiness. Hold the fabric so the stitches pass through all layers, pierce quickly and evenly. Use the beeswax to coat the thread so it slides and resists catching. The beeswax was colder than the heat of the tea, but it took the thread into itself like a small promise. Hana pressed the wax into the line of thread until the surface shone slightly, then showed the apprentice the smallest trick of all. Pull the thread taut, and then let it sit for a beat. The wax keeps the thread from fraying, and, in the long run, the stitches from loosening. The first stitch trembled in Emmy's hands, a small bell note of uncertainty. Hana did not correct sharply. She set a finger over the apprentice's, and the needle slipped through. The line reeled into a neat curve. The cat stirred and settled again, and the sound was as if the house sighed with approval. They made visible stitches. There was no hurry, and haste was a kind of cruelty in a place that was meant to be rest. The technique Hannah preferred was the running stitch for speed combined with an overcast for the edge, so that the patch read as intention rather than disguise. She liked the visible thread, a cord that told the history of the care taken. Each stitch showed up on the outside like a small scar, honest and neat. When the first row was done, Hannah tied a knot that sat flat and then ran a second set of stitches to match, so both sides of the Norrin bore the same quiet geometry. Emmy's face eased into concentration. The thread began to move in time with her breathing. Outside, Sora had set to work with her own merchants, resin, charcoal, and a small leather-bound book of plant remedies. The gardener's fingers were brown at the tips, a map of seasons in miniature. She spoke to Kaito about wood as if it were a plant still breathing, oak that had been felled before its heart hardened, and elm that had a tendency to twist when it dried. Her trick for the shoji frame, she explained, was a smear of sap boiled down with a little rice paste. It tightens the fibers, she said, and when it sets, the paper takes to it like a moth to lantern light. Kaito agreed with a small nod, and reached into his satchel for his plane. The plane smelled like cedar and iron. It was a tool that belonged to his palm as naturally as laughter did to a friend. He tapped the shoji's lower rail and listened. A craftsman's listening is a kind of translation. Knock knock becomes warp. A hollow note becomes a lost tenon. The shoji required a thin strip of oak to replace the bottom rail that had taken on a spring from years of steam and visiting feet. He took the measure with a small wooden caliper, then passed the information on to Finn, who was learning how to mark a piece of wood so the cut might be honest. There was a rhythm to all of this. One set of hands measured while another prepared the glue. One leg of the conversation was the sound of shavings being collected. Another was the soft swish of brushes through paste. Time moved like water in a channel shaped by a purpose. The hourglass sand had not yet finished its pour. The world at the table waited for the sand to thicken and the tea to cool to an obliging temperature. In the meantime, Kaito set a small block of oak on his lap and took up his plane with Finn beside him. He showed the apprentice how to hold the plane, thumb on the rear, palm pressing down near the blade, then how to move it in a long, even pass. "You must let the plane sing," he said, half to Finn and half to himself. "If you force it, the wood resists. If you listen, it will tell you what it needs." The first pass of the plane produced curls like pale ribbons. They fell in a steady pile at Kaito's feet, smelling of warmth and sap. Each shaving had the soft, clean scent of something becoming itself by being taken away. Finn's hands were awkward at first, making short, hesitant passes. Kaito corrected with a whisper rather than a reprimand, guiding the motion with an invisible rule spoken by fingers. After several attempts, Finn found a rhythm, and the plane began to sing. Thin, bright notes that the cat's ears twitched toward. Back at the Norrin, Emilio, Emmy, had reached the point where the outside stitches began to follow a pattern. Hannah let the apprentice experiment with a small decorative knot, not for show, but because patterns are remembered and taught easily. The knitting of a well-made knot is a lesson in patience. It does not reward haste. Emmy took pride in the neat repetition, and smiled in a way that made Hana think of how small victories aggregate into a life. Mr. Harai interrupted the mending with a story of his own, short and luminous, meant to remind rather than instruct. He told of a winter in his youth when a troupe of performers passed through. Their props were broken, their banner was torn, and they had no money. The inn had fixed the banner with leftover silks and thread, and later, when the troupe had moved on, one of their songs lingered in the rooms, as if the notes had taken root in the beams. "We repaired their banner and learned a tune in return," Mr. Arai said, folding the memory like a page. "Repair is currency here as much as coin." That anecdote became another thread for the apprentices to weave into their understanding of repair's moral grammar. To patch was not merely to restore a thing to its former state. It was to write oneself into the history of the place and the people who used it. The visible stitch was a promise that the traveler who passed beneath the Noren would find a threshold tended. The repairs moved at the pace of handwork, patient, punctuated by small corrections. Hana taught the apprentices how to angle the needle to avoid bulk, where to hide the tail of a knot so it would not show on the Noren's face, how to keep the stitches equidistant so the curtain closed with no puckers. Kaido explained the geometry of a tenon, and how a plane should be eased to remove only what was necessary, so the new rail would sit without strain. Sora boiled resin in a tiny pot, and offered a dab of the warm, sticky substance to Hana to seal a loose corner of the shoji frame where steam had eroded the paste. The neighbor, Mr. Mori, produced brass hoops of varying sizes from his satchel, unexpected finds that might serve as small grommets for hanging ties, because in a place like this, every odd object is a possible solution. As hours shifted and the sky deepened to a color that could not be named without surrendering a little of its sharpness, the inn's routine made room for the other human pattern it loved. Arrivals. The door gave its soft, familiar groan, and the traveler's footprints made a dark map across the step. They had come earlier in the evening to fetch water or to leave messages. Now their pace carried the particular exhaustion that belongs to people who have been on the road for too long. Hana noticed the stranger before words were spoken. His shoulders were hunched, his coat sodden in places where salt had already begun to crust. He carried a broom of small, useless sticks. Perhaps he had learned to trust his hands over his purse. He did not look wealthy. He looked like someone whose margins had been pared by miles and weather. Hana moved toward him with the kind of small authority that a house gives to the person who tends it. "You've come at the storm's worst," she said, and in that sentence there was both invitation and assessment. The stranger's relief was visible. Small, as when someone realizes they have not misread a simple kindness. He stepped across the threshold, and the Noren's new patch was between them like a curtain that had already begun to tell its story. There are shelters that operate on logistics, and shelters that are rites. The traveler's rest was the latter. The stranger was led to the bath, where the onsen's warmth waited like a hand, and Sora set out a towel and a basin. Hana showed him where to place his things so they would dry by the brazier. The cat watched the newcomer with a reserve that suggested trust would need to be earned. Kaito offered a spare berth with the plain courtesy of long practice. Finn, having smoothed the shavings into a thoughtful pile, brought the man a cup of tea and sat across as if to confirm his presence. The bath was small and quiet. Steam made the shoji's paper glow from within like a held breath. Hana gave the stranger permission to use the onsen without charge. The exchange would happen later in ways the inn respected. Coin if he had it, a story if he did not, or his labor offered in the morning. Hospitality is never a ledger, balanced with a merciless pen in a house that understands both kindness and necessity. The man soaked until his shoulders loosened and his jaw fell slack. The mineral water had the effect of smoothing the knotted fibers of travel. He emerged, hair plastered to his temples, and wrapped himself in the towel Sora had chosen. He was a plain man, with hands that bore small scars of a life that used them. Work, repairs, gardens, perhaps. He kept his gaze low. In the corner of the room, the hourglass had been turned for another period. Time at the inn was measured in bulbs of sand and in the slow decision to rest. The stranger made a quiet gratitude when he sat at the brazier. He warmed his fingers and let the steam curl across his face. When he finally spoke, his voice was an element of the room as unremarkable as the steam. "I barely thought I would find shelter," he said. Said to whom? To Hana, to the cat, to the house itself. It was an admission and a gift. Hana offered a bowl of rice porridge with pickled radish and a piece of preserved fish. Simple, restorative. Food in this place was more than consumption. It was an act of ordination that marked the body as belonging to the house for the night. The stranger accepted without ceremony, his hands steady. He ate with a patient care that suggested he was attentive to small flavors, as if he were cataloging the world in tastes. In the corner, Emmy watched him and stitched. The simple sight of someone being cared for became a new lesson. Night settled like a blanket, and the traveler's rest adjusted its breath accordingly. The lanterns were lowered, and the brazier's embers became a slow heartbeat. The apprentices wound up their tools and placed them in tidy rows. The carpenter took his plane apart and wiped the blade with oil. Mr. Arai told another short tale, this one about a time when a shoji had been mended with paper taken from a funeral fan, and how the paper had somehow carried with it a gentleness that persisted. The cat moved from one lap to another through the evening, a living seam joining laps and knees into a pattern. But not all things were fixed that night. As the room cooled and cabins of breath formed in the air, Hana walked the engawa, the veranda that ran like a belt around a part of the house, and noticed a plank whose grain had shrunk with moisture and age. It had a subtle cup in the middle, a curve that gathered rain and slowed the step of anyone who might place a foot there. When it was warm and dry, the plank would sing pleasantly underfoot. When it was neglected, it made a dissonant note. Hana put a hand on the wood and listened. It answered with the faint creak of something that would not wait long. Kaito crossed the engawa with his boots muffled and tapped the plank. He frowned in the way carpenters do when a job will need more than a clever trick. "That one will have to come out tomorrow," he said. Precision here mattered. A replacement done in haste would mean another repair soon. He measured the width with an eye that had been taught by scarred fingers, and the apprentices watched as though the act of deciding was part of their apprenticeship. Finn wanted to begin immediately. Hana held him back with a touch against his arm that was both small and decisive. "There is good light in the morning, and less chance of the glue catching frost," she said. "We will spare the wood what haste would take from it." They settled for tonight to do what could be done. The Norin stitched, the shoji paper patched and drying on a frame near the hearth. The small brass hoops Mr. Mori had suggested pressed into the Norin's ties to make hanging easier. The stranger slept in the corner room by the bathing house, snoring softly enough that the sound fit like a third arm around the house. The cat's purr had a steadiness that made the night feel full but not crowded. Hana sat alone for a while, hands folded in her lap, listening to the house. She thought of visible stitches, the rows on the Norrin that made the door honest about its past, and of how repair meant making a thing hospitable to further use. The lantern light painted the room in bands. The hourglass sat on the low table, half empty now. Outside, the sky blackened to the kind of depth that lets you see the edges of thought. The inn was breathing as one thing, patient, careful, and attuned. She moved through the house with small motions of tending, sliding a futon closer to the brazier, tucking a corner of paper behind a lattice so it would not flit in the draught, nudging the kettle to a slower boil so it would not sing too loudly in the quiet. The apprentices came and went in the lamplight, whispering about their mistakes and delights. Emmy went to the Norrin and touched the stitches, feeling their firmness. Finn sat with Kaito and watched a plane being set to a blade, the elders' stories curling into the background like another kind of fuel. When the hourglass emptied once more, they turned it, and, in that act, drew the narrow space of time between them a little closer. The house hummed in small ways, a cupboard settling, a curtain finding its rest, and Hana stood on the threshold of tasks that required more than a single night. The Ngawa plank rose in her mind like a promise and a warning. The stranger's gratitude, the stranger's coin, was still unplaced. The craftsman's pride in precise joints was yet to be tested at dawn. The apprentices still had stitches to master. For a long time she sat with her hands on the low table and watched water bead on the tea's surface. The Norrin, half-mended, swayed a little with the house's respiration. Outside, the snow gathered anew, pressing the world into white quiet. The onsen's steam rose as if in prayer, and the lanterns burned their little choruses of light. The cat curled around Hana's shins, and the house seemed to fold them all into a single breath. She rose to her feet, and, with the care of someone who knows that small decisions make large consequences, she laid out the tools she would want ready at first light. Needles were slipped into felt, the plane wrapped in a cloth, the bowl with the rice paste covered. She spoke to the house not in words but in acts. A mat straightened, a bowl set under the brazier to catch the steam that wanted to wander. The inn had a patient theology. Tending was worship, and the faithful returned each night to the altar of small chores. Before sleep settled the house entirely, Hana walked once more to the Norrin. The new stitches caught the lantern light and made a faint, honest geometry. She placed her palm on the patch and felt the warmth that had seeped through the fibers during the day. The house answered in the tiniest of ways, as houses will when they are satisfied. A shutter let out a contented creak. The floorboards near the bath gave a note of approval. It was enough to hold them until morning, and yet morning held a promise the night could not fulfill. The plank on the Ngawa would be replaced at first merciful light. A particular groove required the patient hand of the carpenter and the attention of a dozen small tasks to set it right. There would be the exacting work of measuring, the shaving of curls that smelled of sap, and the sound of a plane singing its correct note. There would be apprentices' hands learning the difference between pressure and force, between a good pass and a spoiled one. There would be breakfast eaten together, a modest praise for fidelity in work. Hana closed the Norrin gently and let the lantern's warmth gather. She stood for a moment in the shadow of the doorway, feeling the house on both sides of the threshold like a held syllable. If this quiet world soothed you, she might have said, stay a little while. There are more evenings at the Traveler's Rest. The thought was not an advertisement, but a small, hospitable impulse, to invite another to witness the tender architecture of care. She turned away and went to bed with the image of the plank in her mind. Outside, the snow kept its patient work. Inside, the inn settled to the rhythm of the house. Steam, stitch, light. The travelers slept, the apprentices dreamed of knot and planes, and the carpenter laid his head against his palm like a man who trusts the morning. Somewhere between the hush of the house and the cold of the street, the world conspired to keep the promise of dawn. The Ngawa's plank would wait for better light, and the Norren would remain stitched enough for the night. The inn exhaled, and the cat's purr rose to meet its breath. The story of the repairs was only beginning. In the morning, the plane would sing, and the house would make room for another measured miracle, the substitution of a new piece of wood for an old complaint. For now, there was the slow settling of sleep, the tepidness of the brazier, and the thin, unassuming holiness of a place where people repaired what mattered. Dawn arrived on a thread of blue that softened the edges of the world. The first light found the eaves trimmed in a clean, bracing rim of frost. It pooled in the hollows of the garden stones and lit the snow like the inside of the porcelain. The inn woke as if a long-held note had been released. A slow, pleased creak from the rafters, the kettle outside the bathhouse beginning to breathe again, the cat stirring with a deliberate stretch that made its spine sing. Hannah had been awake for a while before she rose. There is a kind of attention that pre-dawn requires, less awake than alert, a readiness tuned by years of living with objects that speak in small sounds. She wrapped a shawl about her shoulders and moved without a hurry the way a river moves, certain of its course. She went to the low table, where the Norren lay quiet, and the still wet shoji paper glowed faintly from the hearth's residual warmth. She straightened the Norren's hem, feeling the line of stitches under her palm, and adjusted a brass hoop until it sat as if it had been there for decades. The rest of the household rose to meet the light with a similar lack of ceremony. Finn, cheeks still hollowed by sleep, carried kindling like a confession. Emmy washed her hands and kissed them with water, as if blessing the day's chores. Mr. Arai came from the small alcove where he slept with the slow gait of someone who rehearses stories on waking. Kaito was already at the workbench in the little annex near the Ngawa, where a single lamp made the wood's grain visible as a landscape. Sora appeared, smelling of cold earth and citrus peel, a thermos of hot, sweet tea tucked into the crook of her arm. The carpentry was to be exacting. They unrolled plans the size of a palm, lines made by Kaito's hand, width, length, the curve at the plank's edge where feet would pass. The Ngawa's plank had cupped and worn. It would be replaced with a piece selected from a board Kaito had kept for occasions that demanded a modest reverence. He preferred oak that had been air-seasoned, the kind that remembered the sun in its grain. He tapped the board with a mallet and listened as a man reads a letter. Each knock gave him a sentence. Finn's breath came quick with eagerness. "May I?" he asked, the single small word of a learning man's humility. Kaito looked up, only once. "Hold the caliper true," he said. "Measure twice, mark once. The wood will not forgive second thoughts." Finn nodded, and held the wooden caliper the way someone holds a fine tool with the reverence of prayer. He pressed the arms against the edge and watched the small shutter of the caliper click into place. Kaito showed him how to transfer the measure to the new board with a marking gauge, a line that would guide the saw and the plane. The apprentice's first line was not straight. It wandered like a hesitant foot. Kaito took the gauge and redrew, slow and steady, explaining that the straightness was a kindness to the wood and to the hands that would follow. "Hear the wood when you mark it," Kaito said, tracing the fresh line with the pad of his thumb, a gesture that made Finn look at the grain as if it were a horizon. "Look where the grain leans. Work with it. It tells you how it wishes to be taken." They set the board across sawhorses. Sora and Mr. Mori moved quietly, ready with clamps and wedges, the small chorus of people around the task like breathing. The saw's first stroke bit like a small, deliberate wind. It left a neat, honest sound as it cut. The cutboard let out a scent, sap and something sun-kept, which the apprentices inhaled as if it were a lesson itself. Planing followed sawing. Kaito's plane was an old friend. Its sole was worn smooth by fingers and years of use. He set the blade to a fine depth and showed Finn the right posture. Feet planted, wrists low, weight distributed. The first long pass took a lot of encouraging pressure. Thin curls of wood began to fall away in pale ribbons. The sound was high and clear at first, and then settled into a steady note. The plane singing in a register that matched the house. Finn tried, and at first the plane chattered, catching the wood. Kaito's hand lay over Finn's for a moment, adjusting the angle, softening the push. "Pressure is not the same as force," Kaito murmured. "Think of pushing a cart with a steady hand, not of pushing a door closed." The difference registered in Finn's face. He smoothed his motion, and the plane made a liquid sound, shedding hair-like curls that smelled of resin and memory. The cat, who had followed the apprentice's every movement as if judging wood with feline exactness, leaned forward to sniff the shavings and then sat back as if satisfied. Hana watched at the threshold and felt a small happiness at the way the work made itself visible. There is a pleasure in seeing craft performed exactly, the honest labor that transforms one thing into another without fuss. She prepared the resin glue in a small pot, stirring rice paste into warmed, boiled-down sap until the mixture thickened to something like honey with a soul. The paste glowed and sent up a faint, sweet steam that mingled with the onsen's breath. Emmy tended to the Norin. The morning light made the indigo patch look a little deeper than the night had shown. She trimmed the thread tails, the small ribbons that had been left by last night's pacing. Hana taught her the last knot, a tidy square knot that sat flat, unobtrusive, and true. "A knot should not boast," Hana said, fingers guiding. "It should hold." Emmy practiced until her fingers remembered the shape. Her small mistakes, the occasional overly tight stitch or a knot that refused to sit, became the pedagogical moments that made the day. Mr. Arai watched with the soft delight of one who knows apprenticeship to be a passing on of quiet lifetimes. He poured tea for himself and for anyone whose hands had been busy, the steam lifting like a small benediction. The shoji lay propped on frames near the hearth, its patched paper drying to an even tension that made it look like a drum skin pulled taut. Sora had smeared resin where the frame needed additional rigidity. As the resin cooled, it shrank a touch and drew fibers into agreement. Mr. Mori hammered in small brass tacks with the care of a man who knows a small metal can solve many things. He produced from his satchel a thin brass plate that Kaito suggested might be used to strengthen the mortise where the plank's tenon would rest. "Old metal helps new wood settle," Mr. Mori said, the line of his smile suggesting stories that made their chores more amusing. Finn was given a chisel and the task of paring the mortise, the small cavity into which a tenon would fit. He knelt on a worn mat, the grain of the Ngawa beneath his knees, and struck the chisel's back with a mallet with precise, controlled taps under Kaito's eye. The first blows were off-center. Wood split where it ought not. Finn's face contracted. He felt a small, keen sting of shame, but Kaito only nodded toward the planing bench. "You will tidy the mistake with the plane," Kaito said. "And when you have learned to correct a mistake, you will have learned something that is worth more than getting it right first." It took a while. The mortise became neat. Finn's cheeks flushed with a kind of exhausted triumph when the tenon slid home with a satisfying click that made the Ngawa sing. The plank fit with a quiet permission, the grain aligning like two hands smoothed into clasp. They hammered soft wooden wedges into the joint until it sat without play. The sound was small and precise, and the house answered in a way that could only be felt. A settled creak, a tiny shift as if a held breath had released. Hana stepped forward with the plan for the final finish. She had a cloth rubbed with camellia oil to warm the wood and bring out its color. She worked the oil along the length until the board gleamed like a tamed river. Sora scattered a few shavings, both as a deterrent to slipperiness and as a traditional courtesy. Wood dust in the doorway is a reminder that a house is lived in, and lived-in things wear their history well. They took the time to test each step. Hana walked the Ngawa with a slow, balanced step, letting the plank speak under her feet. The new board answered with a soft, bright note. Its sound matched the house more easily than the old plank had. Kaito nodded once, satisfied, the kind of slow approval that held the weight of a teacher who trusted his pupil to trust themselves. Inside, the shoji's new paper had dried to a tautness that filtered the morning like a soft veil. Emmy checked the edges, smoothing paste where it showed through too thinly. The Norin hung with an even gravity now. The indigo patch made a small, honest statement at its center. Hana threaded the ties through the brass hoops and tied them with a small double knot that would give without letting go. Practical, thoughtful. The visible stitches on the Norin had a modest beauty, a ledger of care. At breakfast they ate with the kind of fullness that is particular to hands that have made things. Rice steamed in a small iron pot and was fluffed with the reverence of someone who knows a pot to be a container of more than starch. Miso soup, a fragrant bowl of simmered root vegetables with a thin slice of daikon folded like a paper boat. And pickles cut with geometrical kindness were set to the table. The stranger sat among them like a plain object of gratitude. He ate with a quiet composure, his hands steady from work. He offered to help in a small way, sweeping, clearing shavings into a neat pile, and the offer felt like a payment. Mr. Arai recited a short aphorism in lieu of a formal blessing. A table is a seam where strangers may learn to be neighborly. They laughed, a little, and the sound warmed the room better than the brazier. Simple praise was given. Finn for his neat mortise, Emmy for the evenness of her stitches. Hana kissed each on the forehead lightly, an act that acknowledged both apprenticeship and the older, gentle authority she carried. Kaito modestly accepted praise and deflected attention to the wood, which made Finn beam as if he had been the one commended. When the stranger prepared to leave, he folded his coat with a care that looked almost ceremonial. He had slept quietly, and whatever rest he had taken had made some small change inside him. Hana walked with him to the Norin, and did the small thing she always did, brushed lint from the inner hem with the flat of her hand, as if brushing off the last residue of travel. "I have nothing to leave but this," he said, handing over a small object wrapped in a scrap of cloth. The cloth unwound to reveal a small carved wooden fish, smooth with handling, lighter than it looked. It had been whittled with care. The grain formed the scale like ripples of a hand on water. He told them he was a journeyman of sorts, an itinerant maker of small household tools, a man whose hands had been in demand and whose pockets were generous only in the economy of memory. He left a single coin as well, pressed flat in his palm as if it were an afterthought. "We will hold both," Hannah said. "The house keeps what is given, and returns it in other forms." He bowed and slipped out into the snow. The path he left behind showed his departure like a punctuation mark. One last print, then none. The Norren breathed as the door closed, the stitches gauged anew by wind and warmth. After he left, they lingered in a way that the inn kept as a rule. Work followed by reflection. Mr. Arai told one final story, not to instruct but to honor the day's small acts. He spoke of a curtain once mended with thread so bright that travelers thought it a flag and paused to read its stitches as messages. He suggested that every stitch could be read by those who passed as a sentence. We were here, we cared, we pay attention. The apprentices took that as a kind of assignment. Emmy, newly bold, suggested making a small banner from leftover indigo to hang in the servants' room, a small map of stitches that would name who had worked and when. Finn promised to notch his plane with a tiny mark on its side to remember the day. Kaito smiled, and promised to teach them how to set a blade true so it held the memory of the cut. They washed their hands and collected the tools. Each returned the implements to their places with the careful domestic ritual that turned objects into companions. The plane was wrapped, the chisel slipped into leather, the tin of needles closed until its metal chimed faintly. The shavings were swept away and used to stoke a tepid corner of the brazier, so nothing went to waste. The hourglass was turned one more time, not to measure labor, but to remind them that their day would soon be folded into evening. As the sun climbed from the rim of the world, the inn's breath deepened. The repaired Engawa held well under the day's traffic. Guests and villagers came by noon with small requests, and the board accepted each step as if it had always been a natural part of the house. The Norren's patch had already darkened to match the curtain's old dyes. The stitches showed in a neat geometry that looked purposeful rather than corrective. The shoji filtered light into rooms like soft parchment, and Sora placed a tray of sprigs, camellia and cedar, by the bath where their scent would mingle with the onsen's steam. That evening they gathered again, not because the day demanded it, but because living together had discovered this new grammar of shared action. There was talk of plans for the spring, a small festival to celebrate repaired things, a lending shelf for tools where apprentices could borrow under the elder's supervision. Mr. Mori suggested a repair circle on a fortnightly basis, a modest tradition made of hot tea and patient hands. The idea was greeted with warmth. They had found in the day a small proof that the house could convene people into purpose. Emmy stayed up later than she had meant to, winding thread and threading needles. She slept with her fingers smelling faintly of wax and wood glue, and when she woke the next morning the scent felt like a talisman. Finn went to his plane and carried it with the sort of respect that makes a young man learn to speak slowly. He practiced long, even strokes until the plane's song took on a tenor that sounded different from the night before. The stranger's carved fish was placed in a small alcove near the hearth, an offering and a reminder that every guest leaves something, if not coin, then story. Time in the traveler's rest is a thing that is both measured and elastic. Days mark their own boundaries, and yet there is always room for one more cup of tea, one more stitch. The house gathers small energies and refuses to squander them. Hannah found herself at the window in the late afternoon, watching the snow melt in tentative runs where the sun found gaps. Little streams formed along the garden stones, making the world glitter the way a memory might when someone remembers the exact color of a scarf. On one of those quiet evenings, a letter arrived, slid beneath the noren in a fold of brown paper and tied with twine. The handwriting was uneven, as if written on the move. It was from the stranger who had traveled on after the storm. He had found work for a time in a neighboring village, and had written to say he had traded the coin for a meal and the carved fish for a bowl. He thanked them for shelter and promised, in a tone that had the honesty of small things, that if ever he were of use, his hands were for them. Mr. Arai read the letter out loud, and though the words were few, they made the room feel like a place that had been acknowledged. The small festival idea took shape. They would invite neighbors to bring items that needed mending: boots with soles worn thin, a child's coat with a missing button, a lantern with glass that had come loose. Hannah liked the idea of making repair public, of turning stitches into a kind of sermon. They planned the menu: simmered greens, rice wrapped with steamed leaf, and a small fish that would be shared in halves. The apprentices would be given their own station, a small table where their work could be seen and where questions could be asked. When the day of the festival came, it was less a spectacle than a settling of a chair in a long room. People brought small things and sat while the inn's community worked at them. A woman gave Hannah a hat that had seen many winters. Hannah sewed on a new rim and listened to the woman's stories about her grandson. Finn resold a neighbor's footwear, while the man told the apprentice about the places he'd walked. Emmy stitched a child's sleeve and learned to hide the end of thread behind a seam so that the repair would look seamless from the outside. Through the day, the house hummed. The shoji filtered light into gentle pools. The brazier kept a steady, content heat. At the end of the festival, they gathered to clear the place together. It was not joyous because things were new. It was content, a communal satisfaction that sometimes feels like reverence. Mr. Arai stood up and made a joke about the number of needles that had been misplaced that day. The laughter was easy and bright. They counted the small gains: how many items had been made serviceable, how many apprentices had learned a new knot, and concluded that their small economy of repair was a richer one for what it had given. That night, as they wound down, Hannah walked the house in a ritual she had practiced for years. She visited each threshold, smoothing a mat here, tucking a piece of paper behind a lattice there, checking the brazier's coals and refilling kindling. She paused at the noren and placed her palm upon the indigo patch. The patch had darkened further, sewn into the curtain's life as if it had once been part of it. Her hand absorbed the faint warmth left from the sun, and when she withdrew it, there was an intangible lightness, as if a burden had been shifted from one corner to another. The house responded in small ways. A shutter released a soft note. The floorboard near the bath sighed, and the cat, as usual, threaded its way through the ankles of those who moved, claiming laps and presenting itself for adoration. Hannah felt a gratitude that was not theatrical but precise and contained. She had watched apprentices falter and then find steadiness. She had seen a stranger rest and then go, leaving a carved fish in the place of his gratitude. She had seen wooden shavings become a chorus under a plain's song. The traveler's rest had been kept, at least for now. Before sleep took the house entirely, Hannah set about one more small act. She drew the noren aside and, with a deliberate patience, wove a supplementary knot in its tie. Silent, practical, the kind of measure that makes thresholds sturdier, not by force but by thoughtfulness. She said nothing aloud. What she did was enough. A sealed promise that the door would hold, and that those who passed would find that someone had seen their coming. She turned then to the assembled household. "Breathe with me," she said softly, and though it was not a formal practice, the request asked for a shared recognition. For a few breaths they did so, long in, hold, out, matching the inn's slow rhythm until the cat's purr and the brazier's embers became part of the pattern. The breathing was a small hymn, private and communal, a way to lock the day into the architecture of being. When the breath released, the inn felt as if it had gathered its seams in tighter. Hannah looked at each face. Finn, whose plane had begun to sing with steadiness. Emmy, whose stitches made a visible ledger of her learning. Kaito, patient and pleased. Sora, hands stained in ways that told of earth and season. Mr. Arai, whose stories had become a kind of mortar. Mr. Mori, who celebrated improvisation, and the cat, sovereign in its smallness. She saw that the house had given them something important, an occasion to practice care. The travelers' carved fish rested by the hearth, a reminder of the exchange that had passed. Shelter for story, kindness for memory. It would remain there until another hand needed a small talisman to remember what hospitality felt like. The Norin, patched and honest, swung very slightly with each breath of the house, and the shoji filtered the lamplight into quiet bars that made the room look like a page of a book. In the morning, the dawn will come again. The Ngawa will be walked upon, and the plain will be oiled and called into its song. Something else will need the patient attention that people within a house provide to each other. That is the work and the blessing of a place such as this. It does not end in a single repair, but continues in the small decisions made each day. Hannah closed her eyes for a moment, feeling the day settle as one might fold a letter and tuck it away. She then rose and moved through her household with the quiet choreography of someone who has both authority and tenderness. She wiped the last of the glue from a tool and set it down with a faint clink, not unlike the sound of a vow kept. If you should ever find yourself wandering, and the world is large and weathered at the edges, there will be a door with a patched curtain where lantern light pools like warm bowls. If you enter slowly and with weary hands, the house will answer you in ways that do not demand more than you can give. Tea, a place to dry, a listening ear, and perhaps an invitation to mend something that needs mending. The traveler's rest keeps its thresholds honest, its stitches visible, and its hearth warm for those who pass through. Tonight the Norin breathes evenly. The house is kept for now. If this quiet evening has found you, and you wish to return for more slow hours, stay a little longer in this company. There will be more nights to keep and more small repairs to witness.